Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We have got so much to do, and despite the fact that it was not a great day for Georgia on Saturday, we're still in a really good mood today and still in a really good position, I think, to discuss everything that is happening with UGA. No longer the number one team in the country. What's that about? Injury concern as it relates to Tate Ratledge. We got new information on that, and that probably does harm our good mood at least a little bit, but we'll get some very important analysis on that topic from Jon Stinchcomb here today. But also to kick things off, there's the matter of this. What exactly is the crucial takeaway from the win against Kentucky that was far closer than experts thought it should be? Well, I think to properly explain that, we do have to go back in time at least a little bit based on things we've been saying on this show for the last few days. I don't intend for this to be self-serving, but I do believe it's an important part of the overall narrative about this game on Saturday. So that's where we'll be to begin with. Your concerns about what you saw on the field will be addressed in full over the course of the next couple of days. So we're glad to have you with us for it as we get it started here today. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
You know, hopefully I have a reputation for being pretty modest. I try not to come on here and do a lot of self-serving bragging and things like that because, honestly, you don't want to hear it. It'd be the worst thing in the world I could do as far as, making my audience grow and be happy is to come on here and talk about myself a bunch. So hopefully I don't do that. But in order to properly make the point I think that needs to be made today, at least for a couple of seconds here to begin, I'm going to have to be a little bit self-serving. And I don't do this to kind of prop myself up. I do this because I think it allows additional context for what happened on Saturday in a game that was far from what Georgia fans hoped it would be against the Kentucky Wildcats, a margin of victory much more narrow than what experts were sort of calling for. So let's go back in time here just for a moment. Before the first game of the season against Clemson, I spent a lot of that week leading into the game saying, despite the fact that Georgia was about a 2-touchdown favorite, I thought that Georgia was likely to win the game by about 30-something points, that I didn't think the game would be close at all. As it turns out, I got that exactly right. Many of you remember it. You're kind enough to give me credit for that there at the time. Last week, prior to the game against Tennessee Tech, despite the fact that FanDuel and some of the other major sports books had the point spread listed somewhere in like the 52, 53-point range, I said the actual spread should probably be 44.5 points, and the truth is Georgia won the game by 45 points. In other words, I hate to say it this way, I haven't just been correct with my opinions on Georgia football thus far this season. I have been precise and darn near perfect. And once again, I don't love saying that, but the results obviously speak for themselves. And those statements about the first 2 weeks, the game against Clemson, the game against Tennessee Tech, led us into what I said last Tuesday about going into this game against Kentucky. And this is one of those instances where I probably am not happy to have been as right as I turned out to be. But in terms of the fact that this was sort of seen coming before it happened, I think it gives us additional context for talking about exactly what did happen against Kentucky on Saturday. So let me give you some audio and video proof here of the fact that the result for Georgia on Saturday was not as maybe unforeseeable as some would have you believe. This is what we said on that topic last Tuesday. Some of my purpose for this topic here today is to sort of get out in front of something because I don't want 2 weeks of not the prettiest game in the world, Georgia not winning by the most impressive margin in the world, Georgia making Kentucky perhaps look better against it than Kentucky looked against South Carolina. I'm sort of trying to get in front of this here a little bit because I really don't want, if we can avoid it, I don't want 2 weeks worth of negativity going into the game against Alabama on September 28th because we all have to have our game faces on for that. Just being totally honest here, I have an ulterior motive. I have an agenda with this topic here today. I'm trying to get out in front and remind you that week before a bye week, a lot of times Georgia's been, not its prettiest, not the most dominant win, not the largest number of style points, not the showcase of, fireworks and laser show and things like that. And on Saturday for Georgia, that might once again be true. So there you go. That's me last Tuesday telling you that Georgia favored by about 24 points, that I did not expect the margin of victory for Georgia to come close to that for the reasons that I cited, that Georgia going into a bye week just typically doesn't do that. Outright loss to South Carolina in 2019, outright loss to LSU in 2018, outright loss to Vanderbilt in 2016, 1-9 against the spread in those instances, that Georgia just does not typically play its best going into a bye week for whatever reason. And on Saturday, the same thing might be true once again. So here you have 3 weeks worth of football games, calling it on the button. Georgia beats Clemson by more than 30, calling it on the button. Georgia beats Tennessee Tech by about 45, and calling it on the button that Georgia probably would not beat Kentucky in anywhere near as impressive a fashion as the experts were assuming they were going to in Lexington, Kentucky on Saturday night. Now, the purpose of all of this is not to have everybody marvel and say, wow, look how smart BA is, because the truth is I'll still get plenty wrong over the course of a season of kind of giving out opinions. I'm not any more, I guess, intelligent than anybody else is when it comes to stuff like that. But it's also important to say that this was not the most shocking thing that has happened for Georgia when it comes to this particular game. So therefore, then, what do you take from it? Well, I think that Georgia fans are well within their right to be disappointed. Your favorite team didn't play well. Your favorite team did not look very crisp, very sharp. And even if it was in keeping with what we have seen from Georgia in similar situations before, you're still well within your rights to say, well, how come it wasn't better than that? And, some of that's going to kind of go to what's going on with the offense right now. What about the lack of explosiveness? What about just the, in the case of this game on Saturday, just not enough points? Georgia scored 1 touchdown and didn't do that until very late in the game. If you want to have some questions about and have some, I guess, debate about what is or isn't happening for the Georgia offense right now, I think you're well within your rights to do that, even if the actual result on Saturday was one we had kind of warned you about, prior to the game being played. And if you want to talk about in particular what seemed to be kind of an uncharacteristic performance for the Georgia offensive line, we'll talk to Jon Stinchcomb more about that here in a little bit, about exactly why it was that they were not quite dominating the way that we typically hoped that they would, or maybe for someone like me, maybe expected that they would over the course of this season. I think you're well within your rights to ask some questions about that. I totally do. Where are the playmakers for this offense right now? I think you're well within your rights to ask about that. Is the fact that Georgia once again gave up far more rushing yards than you would certainly hope they would after giving up 100-plus to Tennessee Tech last week, giving up a pretty significant rushing total on Saturday. Is this solely a function of the fact that Georgia's still pretty banged up with its defensive line and they're having to play a small number of players, a very large number of snaps? Is that what this is? Or is this a case of maybe those defensive line issues that Georgia had last season not being fully fixed here for this year? Once again, I think you are well within your rights to ask all those questions. We did all this Saturday night on our DawgNation postgame show. We're essentially a sports talk show here right now. This is the fan conversation around Georgia football. And, of course, obviously, we always want to reflect all of that. So I think you're well within your rights to do all of that. But if you'll allow me to, let me say this. The reason why I played the clip that I just played a moment ago was, once again, not to pat myself on the back. I'm not Barry Horowitz in that way. The reason why I played that clip is because, as I told you last week, be really careful about expecting too much from this game against Kentucky, given this is a very similar circumstance to Georgia kind of not being at its best before, and be really careful about maybe fostering too much negativity for the 14 days prior to Georgia going to Alabama. Okay, so now that moment has arrived. And once again, even if it kind of grates on your nerves a little bit, I'm going to tell you, be really careful about getting too negative about Georgia, even though the performance on Saturday wasn't particularly positive. Be really, really careful about that. because we have seen Georgia not quite at its best in games before, only to see them rise to the occasion when it mattered most. And maybe that's what we're about to see for Georgia here, there as well. And if that does occur, if Georgia is about to play better, if they're about to kind of find something, another gear, an additional level of performance in the games that matter most, then maybe you dig deep here a little bit and you look for some positives, not a ton, admittedly so, but some positives within the game that was. Let me just sort of try to give you three here for a moment as a way of kind of just sort of slowing down what looks to be a little bit of runaway train on blame Bobo and mad about Georgia and, this team, And I'm not mocking all of that because I think that fans have a right to express their opinion. I really, really do. I've told you that before. I think that your opinion matters and you have a right to express your opinion. But I do sometimes want to kind of stand athwart it and yell stop when I have a chance and just say, maybe don't get too out of control on some of this. There are still some positives to take from this. For instance, were you happy to have Dominic Lovett on your team on Saturday night? I certainly was. I thought it was really nice that Lovett stepped up for Georgia in such a big way. The catch on the second down play when Georgia was backed up near its own end zone, and obviously, Kentucky was trying to get the football back. They had punted for the purpose of doing that. Georgia got much more aggressive, it seemed, with its play calling. Lovett came up pretty big there, was Georgia's leading receiver on Saturday. As someone who's a Georgia partisan, who's someone cheers for Georgia, I was pretty happy to have Dominic Lovett on my favorite team on Saturday. And I thought that Dominic's performance overall was a pretty big positive. Similarly speaking, were you happy to have Trevor Etienne on your team on Saturday? Etienne, we were told at halftime, was banged up. He was battling and dealing with a shoulder injury, and it wasn't obvious that he was going to come back and play in the second half. And by the way, if he didn't come back in, it also wasn't obvious who was even going to play running back for Georgia at that point in time because Nate Frazier didn't play in the first half, and we'll get more into that probably at some point in time this week, exactly what might be going on there. But the point is like Etienne had to really fight through some pain to play. And on the touchdown drive that Georgia was finally able to muster, Trevor Etienne was a big part of how Georgia kind of got into that scoring situation. Did you get the glimmer? And we actually also talked about this last week too. Did you get the glimmer that maybe as Georgia moves into its most important football, that you might have something you can kind of lean on when it comes to Trevor Etienne? Did he show you a little spark that makes you feel okay about that? I think that's probably the case. And the other positive for me on Saturday, in a game that probably didn't have as many of those as you would have liked, how great was it to once again have a Georgia defense? They did not play perfect. Gave up more rushing yards. Seems to be really thin right now, I think, when it comes to the defensive line of scrimmage, that had its issues. But how great was it, though, to have a Georgia defense that once again, for the third time in 3 games this season, kept its opponent out of the end zone. They found a way, even if they were giving up some rushing yards and playing with some tired and fatigued players, that once again kept its opponent out of the end zone. How great was that to see from Georgia on Saturday? Now, after the game, Kirby Smart talked about that. We'll hear that in a moment. But how about just sort of prior to that, the overall idea of, what we had kind of talked about, which was, hey, listen, this game, this opponent sort of feels like what it's felt like before. The fact that Georgia had to overcome some adversity, Kirby Smart acknowledged all of that and kind of talked about the fact that just the same way that Georgia fans weren't happy about this, Smart himself was not happy either. This is Kirby after the game.
Well, I'd rather not paste it. I mean, I didn't prefer it to be that way. But I also told people all week, I knew it. I mean, we played on the road at Missouri 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I guess, 3 years ago, I don't know when it was. And then we played on the road at Auburn. I get it. When you go on the road for the first time in the SEC at night and you keep a team in the game, you don't start fast. It's going to be a challenge. And we responded to the challenge. And the best thing is we got a lot of things we can work on now.
So that's Kirby Smart there on that. And obviously, one of the things that allowed this adversity, tough conditions, road game, all of that allowed Georgia to still walk out of there with a win was the fact that the defense kind of buckled down when it mattered most. Here's also Kirby Smart talking about that.
I felt like it was a bend but don't break kind of scenario. Kept giving up plays, but the one thing I thought Schumann and the defensive staff did a tremendous job game planning. I thought he called a really good game. He helped our players. A couple of drives or penalties would have been punts and not 3 points, and I think the game would have been better for us. But I'm proud of the way they played. They bowed their neck when they had to, and we took away a lot of shots. They are a shot team, and they have extremely fast wideouts, and I thought we covered the shots well.
So I think that's exactly right, and that's ultimately, I mean, if Georgia gives up a touchdown in this game, it probably loses the game. So the defense did step up and play well when it mattered most. But let me kind of wrap all this topic up this way. You know, I start by saying, hey, I told you Georgia would beat Clemson by 30-something, and it did. I told you that Georgia would beat Tennessee Tech by about 44, 45, and that's exactly the way that game worked out. And I told you that Georgia might not be very pretty against Kentucky, and that's exactly how that game worked out too. I mean, we have been very precise and accurate with our predictions on Georgia results thus far this season. So if you're listening and watching right now, you may be saying, okay, well, smart guy, why don't you tell us what's about to happen then? What happens next if you're so smart about everything that's going on with Georgia football? And here's where things get, I think, a little bit interesting. That the previous games for Georgia here this season, neutral site, non-conference game against a ranked Power 4 opponent, we've seen Georgia play very well in those games a lot in recent years. On the road, prior to a bye against what appears to be an overmatched opponent like Kentucky, we've seen Georgia not play very well in games like that a lot in recent years. In other words, we're going on like 9 years worth of Kirby Smart. There's a fairly well-established track record of what Georgia sort of looks like and the kind of typical template for the games that Georgia plays. But as we move forward, Georgia's not going to be playing a typical Georgia schedule, and this won't be a typical Georgia season anymore. Things are about to get very, very interesting. It's unusual, frankly, for Georgia to even play at Alabama. It hasn't done that very much in the Kirby Smart era, just one time, and that was during the pandemic. It's never played a game like Texas on the road with Texas now in the SEC, and everything else that comes up after that's also pretty strange there as well. So leaning on predictions for what have been typical Georgia games won't help you quite as much when Georgia's about to move into a very atypical Georgia schedule. But the same themes of the past still prevail now. Georgia using this time of year to figure out what it is and figure out how to get better and be at its best when the games matter most. And just because Georgia did not play very well against Kentucky, don't assume this team won't be more than ready for the test in Tuscaloosa coming up in 2 weeks. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Happy to have you with us here as a part of the program today on video 10 a.m., radio, Athens Sports Radio 96 The Ref, podcast, wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, everything else. Just really happy to have you as a part of the program here today. And big thanks to our friends at Pella Window and Door for making it all possible there as well. You know, we're driving back from Lexington yesterday. We saw a big Pella sign as we were driving, and the folks in the car, hey, there's Pella. And I love the fact that when you see that Pella logo, just like we were Kaylee and Jeff and Cody in the car, they all pointed that out. I love the fact that when people see that Pella logo, whether it be on a sticker, on a window, in a house that's being built, you always know it's a great builder when they're using a great product like that to for their home. Or when you see a billboard or something along those lines, you're reminded, oh yeah, BA talks about Pella Window and Door of Georgia. I love the fact that you're thinking about that when you see that Pella logo out there, because you know it's great windows, great doors. It's the highest quality product of all when it comes to something like that. So if it's time for you to upgrade, it's time for you to have a conversation with one of the Pella experts. You can give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. You can also find them online, PellaofGA.com/DawgNation. Then we got to check that website there a little bit too. I believe they got a new website. We got to make sure we're giving the right one there on that. But I believe we're going with PellaGA.com now. That's PellaGA.com on that front. But great stuff from our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Always viewed to be the best. Stop by and see them in Duluth. Take advantage of great savings. Make sure you enjoy everything that Pella has got going on right now. Make sure you check all of that out today. Okay, let's do a couple of things here just for a moment. Obviously, we got Jon Stinchcomb coming up. We have got a lot happening down in Florida right now. Lousy, stinking Gators are a mess. We will revel in all of that here coming up in just a little bit. And I'm going to talk about the other big news that happened for Georgia yesterday. So all that's coming up here in a moment. Let me do two things prior to getting there. First of all, as I told you before, in 2 weeks in Tuscaloosa. It's just going to be an absolutely massive football game for Georgia, and we want you ready for it. And part of the way we get ready for that is with our DawgNation Invasion. We want you there. We want you to be a part of it. And the time is now to get your travel package secure while there is still some space, to secure your DawgNation Invasion t-shirt while we still have them, and all of that. Please make sure you check that out today. It's DawgNation.com/tailgate. You can also go to ATLSportsTrips.com, DawgNation.com/tailgate, or ATLSportsTrips.com. You can lock in and be a part of our DawgNation Invasion to Tuscaloosa. If you want the travel package that includes a couple nights stay right there in Hoover, Alabama, prior to the game, the night after the game, and then the luxury motor coach transportation for the side of the tailgate there on game day, you can get that. If you just want to be a part of the party on Friday night or the tailgate on Saturday, you can do that there too. So it's DawgNation.com/tailgate or ATLSportsTrips.com to be a part of DawgNation Invasion, powered this year by our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips, as we get ready to go to Tuscaloosa 2 weeks from right now. Let me also do one more thing here, too, before we kind of get back to the action, which is to let you know that tomorrow is a little bit weird around here. I have a work assignment that I have to do for it's kind of away from DawgNation a little bit. It's kind of as a part of our, I guess, larger corporation, representing DawgNation on behalf of our corporation tomorrow. I'm honored to get a chance to do that. So during our normal show time tomorrow, I will not be here. We're going to record a show today to air tomorrow. So it's all going to be, honestly, to tell you what we're going to do, we're going to get heavy into some of the stuff with the Georgia offense and kind of what's going on and some of what fans are saying about Mike Bobo in particular. We're going to do a lot of that tomorrow on the show. We're also going to talk about a playmaker that's really emerging for Georgia, I think, at the exact right time. We're going to get a lot into that there as well. So it's a great show tomorrow. But because of the fact that I have to be away, as I said before, kind of representing DawgNation to the rest of our corporate folks here tomorrow, it's going to have to be pre-recorded. That means if you're joining us live, typically at 9:50 for kind of our show before the show, tomorrow we will not have that. And our R.S. Andrews cool down at the end of the show where I take comments, tomorrow we won't be able to have that either. We're back to normal on Wednesday. This is not a day off for me. It's just a kind of an assignment that requires me to be gone during the normal show time. So we're going to record today to get you ready for all of that. Does that make sense? That's the story tomorrow. Still the same show you've come to expect, but if you're a live viewer, no live comments either before or after. So just to be kind of clear on all of that. All right, so with that said, before we bring on Jon Stinchcomb, let's get ready to go around the doghouse here today, poured by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And I want to deal with a couple of things here for a moment. Obviously, the big news from yesterday, and admittedly, I was a little surprised by this. I thought this was more of a reaction than I expected to see. Georgia did drop to number 2 in the Associated Press poll. Enough voters changed their opinion of Georgia moving towards Texas that Georgia now drops to number 2. Texas sort of moves up to number 1. And I thought that Danny Cannell, who's sort of a noted SEC hater, obviously, but I thought he had an interesting opinion that probably mirrors that of some Georgia fans on this. I want to read this to you on the screen here for a moment, what Cannell said. He says, Kirby Smart should send every single AP voter who voted Texas number 1 some flowers. That's exactly what Kirby needs to create that chip on the shoulder for Georgia. So that is what Danny Cannell had to say about that, and I think it probably does mirror what some Georgia fans sort of think a little bit about this too. But for me, while I get that sentiment overall, and ultimately it probably doesn't matter if Georgia or Texas are ranked number 1 right now, they're going to play each other in October, and they may rematch again in December if all goes well for both teams. I do think, though, this kind of misunderstands something, and that I think commonly gets misunderstood. You know, coaches have done a really good job of conjuring up some sort of like psyop where they've made people think that the number 1 job that a coach does is motivation. How do you find a new level of motivation? How do you not fall prey to rat poison, to use the old Nick Saban phrase? How do you spin something to your advantage to give, as Danny Cannell just said there, the chip on your shoulder before a game like that? That coaches have really convinced a lot of people that the number 1 thing they do is find the proper level of motivation. And I'm sorry, whether it comes to beating Alabama in 2 weeks or beating Texas a couple of weeks after that, while motivation is clearly a part of it, I don't think that motivation overall is the biggest unanswered question for Georgia. I think the bigger unanswered questions for Georgia relate to not the frame of mind that the Georgia talent is in, but how is that talent used on the field? The talent that you have right now, how do you deploy those guys? Because ultimately, and as I said before, we'll get more into this in tomorrow's show, Georgia did not score enough points against Kentucky. However you kind of assign the blame for that, one way or another, Georgia did not score enough points against Kentucky. I don't think it's the end of the world because, as I told you, we sort of saw this coming. But the result itself was not good enough. And if I had to assume, well, was Georgia just not properly motivated for the game? My guess is that's not what it was. My guess is there are some buttons somehow that could have been pushed differently. Either Carson Beck a little more sharp on the field, a level of play calling to unlock the playmakers, from the sidelines of the coaching booth. But one way or another, not an issue of lack of motivation, more of an issue of lack of execution or lack of, whatever from a strategic standpoint. But it's not really a motivational issue. So people always grab onto the motivation that if you're ranked number one, that's rat poison, and if you're ranked less than number one, somehow you've got the extra competitive edge. But games are actually won by how the chess pieces are moved on the board. And whether it be, Carson Beck's, execution of the offense when he's got the ball in his hand or the decisions that are made before the ball is snapped, the overall execution has got to be better. And if the execution is better, my guess is we'll find out in weeks to come whether Georgia's ranked number one or not, that the actual motivation is probably exactly where it needs to be if they can just be a little sharper than they were on Saturday. One more thing here, and we'll get to this with Jon Stinchcomb. It certainly looks like, and there's a story up at DawgNation.com right now, our buddy Rusty Manziel reporting, that it looks like that Georgia's going to be without Tate Ratledge for a while, maybe even until the month of November, hoping to perhaps get him back for the Florida game there. But if you saw the video, you're talking about ankle, you're talking about knee, you're talking about kind of just getting rolled up on it. Just so happened I was actually watching that right when it occurred. Sort of saw it when it happened. Obviously, Ratledge in kind of a tough situation there, comes back onto the field later on, very braced up, both knee and ankle there. You see, if you're watching a video, getting some embraces, from some of his teammates there. Obviously, kind of a tough situation for Tate, and now a tough situation for Georgia, as has been reported, the Dogs without Ratledge for the next few weeks, including the Bama game and the Texas game, without one of your most important leaders. So obviously a big setback there. We'll talk to Jon Stinchcomb more about that in a moment. But that, for now, is Around the Doghouse. It's poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And, of course, when it comes to a great college football Saturday, Dr. Pepper goes great with all of that. In fact, it's not really game day unless you've got the rich, one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper making your game day special. So whether it's the, limited time flavors like Dr. Pepper Strawberries and Cream, the really creative flavors, or the regular Dr. Pepper, or if you're like me, the Diet Dr. Pepper, the Dr. Pepper Zero Sugar, the creamy coconut we've talked about a lot, get yourself some delicious Dr. Pepper and make that a big part of your college football experience. The Fansville commercials, obviously a big part of the sport, and you getting stocked up on Dr. Pepper, big part of those college football game days there as well, because it's a pepper thing. You can go to drpepper.com for more on that. All right, so we're going to do, before we're done, more on what might be happening, the unraveling of Billy Napier down in Gainesville, Florida. We'll touch on that. But for now, everything that just goes down with Georgia slipping past Kentucky, and what does it all mean, and where do you go from here? Let's talk about all of that today with Jon Stinchcomb, here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, let's say hello to Jon Stinchcomb, and obviously we'll bring in Jon here on a topic that unfortunately he probably knows very well. It's one we wish we weren't discussing here today, but details come out about the injury to Tate Ratledge, reporting out there that Georgia for the next few weeks going to be without him. Maybe if you saw the injury on Saturday, this is not necessarily a surprise. But I guess, Jon, let's do two things in this. First of all, I guess the overall outlook for Ratledge. Can a few weeks here be enough to get him back to 100%? And if you have to play without him for the Bama game, or if you have to play without him for the Texas game, could you still have hopes of having him be a major part of a playoff run for Georgia if it were to occur? Like, how concerned would you be about the remainder of the season for Ratledge based on what you saw on Saturday night?
Yeah, I mean, without knowing the exact extent of the injuries, it's hard to speculate. But because the season is so long and they aren't projecting right now that it will need surgery and be out for the rest of the season, I think that bodes well for this Georgia offense in general, and really Tate for this year. I know he has really high expectations and was hoping to kind of plant his flag as one of the premier guards coming out of college football. So it gets sidetracked a little bit. I'm hoping for a speedy recovery for him, but the good news for Georgia is they've been in a 3-guard rotation for this entire season, and Micah Morris is no stranger to the field. I think more than anything, it just kind of highlights the need for depth for every team, and Georgia has that right now, and at least a 3 deep that you're going to rely upon Fairchild and Micah Morris to step in and fill some rather big shoes, but it's not an unfamiliar situation for either player because that's been the rotation this entire season.
It did not seem like it was a great night overall for the Georgia offensive line. Did you get much of a sense of how Micah Morris, who's obviously played some good football for Georgia, how he played when he went in for Ratledge on Saturday? And I guess the additional context is how much of a loss do you anticipate it'll be for Georgia not to have Tate on the field?
Oh, I punished myself on Sunday. I watched the film again and again, just trying to figure it out. It was such a poor performance, and blame gets a healthy scoop, falls on everyone's plate. You watch the film, the offensive line didn't play well. There's a number of just poorly executed plays, but there's also a number of plays where you're going, is this the best situation? We're running into a 7-man box with only 6 players to block. That's a bad deal. The reason why Etienne is trying to make everyone miss is because we don't have everyone accounted for. So I don't know if that's a scheme issue, if that's a decision-making issue from Carson. I know there was a couple of zone reads where you're going, if this is the zone read, the ball should be pulled and Carson should still have it in his hands. Or if there are options that you can check into or check out of a certain play, then that needs to be made. And they were not. They're bad looks. So, yes, some of the blame does fall at the feet of this offensive line that candidly didn't have their best game, but they're not the only ones to blame. There are a number of plays where, it's an extension of the outside zone. We're kind of changing the front a little bit and kick it out to a wide receiver with expectations of tight ends and wide receivers serving as those front blocking bodies, and they whiff. So it was just a poor offensive performance top to bottom. And I think we should come to learn that expectations are high and we need a better performance from this offensive unit. I think more than anything, we were bailed out by the defense and a Kentucky team that was punching above their weight class, but doing so admirably.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I want to talk to you more about what the game was and what it kind of wasn't for Georgia on Saturday. But let me also kind of bring you in on what we were just discussing a moment ago, too, that Georgia now drops out of the #1 ranking. And obviously, from the coach, the player perspective, where you're ranked doesn't really matter. The job, is unchanged in terms of what it takes to beat Alabama or anything after that. But it is still a pretty fun fan conversation and kind of within the boundaries of sports talk. This is just sort of the kind of thing we do talk about. I was pretty surprised that enough voters changed their mind on Georgia, despite the fact that Georgia did not play a good game. I was still surprised that many AP voters, they have a tendency to be pretty conservative about stuff like this, that they changed their mind on Georgia and Georgia dropped to number 2. Given what you know about Georgia right now through 3 games, what you know about Texas through 3 games, and Ohio State's a part of this conversation too, although they really haven't played a notable game yet. Do you think that dropping Georgia on Saturday was fair?
More than fair. If I were a voter, I would put Texas in front of them right now. I watched the performances both on Saturday, and Texas is the better team right now. You watch what Georgia did against Kentucky, the offensive execution, the threats, the missed opportunities, the lack of opportunities that existed. And I think they've earned the opportunity to cede that first place position. With that said, does it really matter? No. They end up winning the game. They're still undefeated in regular season for Lord only knows how many games in a row, especially in the SEC. It's still in a prime position, but if I'm a voter, I'm basing it not on what you've done in previous seasons, but what I've seen. What I've seen is a capable team, and that's the reason why they're number 2 still. It's an extremely talented roster. But based on that performance against a Kentucky team that was borderline embarrassed the previous Saturday, it didn't look like the number 1 team to me in the country. And Texas outperformed what should be expected when you lose your starting star quarterback. And, granted, they have yet another stud waiting in the wings in Arch Manning, who goes on to have 5 touchdowns. So if you're comparing apples, then one looks a heck of a lot tastier and shinier right now than the other. And I think there's plenty of justification for that kind of switch.
So to kind of get back into what the Kentucky game wasn't that some Georgia fans and most Georgia fans hoped that it would be, I told you last week, let me start with this. I told you last week that I had a little bit of an intuition, a little bit of a suspicion that things just weren't quite clicking with the Georgia offense, that there's just something that's just a little off right there. And, I don't really know where that is for me. Is this, Carson Beck not playing the way that he's supposed to? A lot of Georgia fans, as they, sometimes do, kind of pointing the finger at Mike Bobo. Like, do you have a main culprit if we're playing the blame game here? Do you have a finger to point at why Georgia only scored 1 touchdown on Saturday and was frankly lucky to get that one?
Yeah, well, first off, I've got 10 fingers, and I'm going to use all of them because if I had 11, it would be across the board. All 11 guys on the offense, they just didn't play well. We didn't block well enough on the interior, obviously, with the offensive line, but it's not solely for them to bear the brunt of this blame. You look at our tight ends, Urasek and Delp specifically, there's plenty of points of attack that they miss on their block. I think there was times where Kentucky's effort was superior than ours. First play of the game, exceptional effort by an unaccounted for backside outside linebacker running down the play from behind. That's Kentucky wanting it. Not saying that Georgia didn't. I don't think effort is really the main culprit. But if I'm going to place blame on anyone, it's going to be my Heisman front-running quarterback, where I don't know whether it was his I don't know. I don't have enough information to say Carson had the ability to check us out of plays, or he had the opportunities on these zone reads to keep the ball, or there was times where I felt like he was flushed out of the pocket where he could probably stay in the pocket. So that decision-making piece for me, I don't have all the information that I need to really evaluate the film on those specific plays. But if he does have those options to check us out of a run play when we don't have enough blockers, where there's 7 defenders, and I heard Coach Smart talk about it since this game, of saying ETN is making guys miss in the hole. He's right. And it's not because of poor offensive line play. It's because they have an extra defender in that space that we can't account for, that your slot receiver is expected to dig out, and he has no chance to do that. So there's got to be a better play. Is that scheme? Is that opportunity for Beck to check us into something else? Is it a zone read where he can pull and keep it and gain the grounds with his legs? Because it's a zone read play. I just don't know if he has that opportunity to pull it. Or is it a business decision? Is he just saying, I'd rather have ETN have it than take that kind of risk? I don't know those things. You add that on top of the fact that there were some missed throws. The quarter rollout that there's 2 wide receivers one-on-one with a safety. Either one are great options, and we missed that. Those are big plays that that is an execution issue from the quarterback spot. So plenty of blame goes all the way around. If there's one culprit, I think you say, let's start with the top and work our way down, and that's at the feet of Carson Beck.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way, too, and I want to be really careful, and I know you do, too. Like, I don't want to make this more than it needs to be because we got 9 regular season games to go and, I guess the potential for, 11 more – no, way more than that 13 more games in total here. Then there is a lot of football left to be played. But the thing that I sort of found myself thinking on Saturday, and this makes me different than a lot of like the social media chatter and things like that, where it was a lot of the blame Bobo stuff. And I'm not here to absolve anybody from criticism. If you didn't have a good game, I mean, we got to call balls and strikes. But I really kind of found myself thinking more along the lines of, for a Georgia offense that doesn't have Brock Bowers anymore, and early in the season that still matters, Carson Beck is a guy who's gotten so much attention and so much in the way of accolades. Maybe it was too much. Maybe that's a lot to live up to, but it was existing nonetheless. And I just didn't see Beck putting his fingerprints on this game the way that a potential number 1 overall draft pick and Heisman Trophy winner you would like for him to be able to. The way that Brock Bowers single-handedly took over the Auburn game, for instance, last year. Another road game in which Georgia wasn't playing very well. Brock Bowers simply would not allow Georgia to lose that game. Now, Beck did make some big throws on the final sequence. Obviously the big pass to Dominic Lovett, for instance. So it's not like there was a total absence of moments. But, I'm just really ready for Carson Beck to just put his stamp on this season. And by the way, the biggest games are still yet to come. That'd be a great time for that to happen. And I obviously believe that Carson Beck has a great chance to do that and likely will do it. I really don't want to make this more than it needs to be. But if we're going to have a conversation about why this game on Saturday wasn't what some fans wanted it to be, I do find a lot of my energy around, when is Carson going to look like the Carson that I think we all thought he had the potential to be and probably think he still eventually will be. At what point in time does that really kind of kick itself into gear? I mean, if I'm being completely candid, that's what I'm still sort of waiting for.
Yeah, I want all the listeners to hear Carson Beck is more than capable. I mean, He's got all the skills we've seen in him perform at a very high level. So it's not a critique of like, this guy has a low ceiling. He's not the player that we think he is. That's not what I'm saying. And I don't think it's what you're saying either. As a matter of fact, I think on Saturday, it's more of times where just make the simple be simple and, make the plays that are there. Just make the decisions that we've seen you make. That's why I think one of the strengths of his game is being a good decision maker and putting us in situations and putting the ball in places that they're supposed to go. And on Saturday, I think it was a departure from that. I think there was a number of times where it wasn't the right decision that was made, whether it was, to flush the pocket early when it was still there or work through your progressions when a receiver is still managing, he's still going through his route and comes open a little bit later, and Carson's already moved on from that. So he is more than capable. I am very grateful that he is the quarterback of the University of Georgia. It is a blessing. With that said, Saturday was not his best performance. And I think this season, there have been some opportunities that have just been missed. Some are easier to see just out of the gates than others. And I think the more you watch film, you're going, are you pressing too hard? Do you feel the weight on your shoulders where you're trying to create when the play itself can, if you just have a little more patience, maybe it will come to you and you just do what's in the system. You don't have to be Superman. You don't have to do something that's super special. Just execute what's called there, and it will only elevate your game. I think at times, you feel that of like, if I'm the marquee guy, then I've got to do something elite without doing the meat and potatoes stuff first. And Saturday, I felt like that kind of showed its head more than anything. Is there were some meat and potato opportunities. It might not have been flashy. It might not have been exceptional. But if you just work within what's given, there's more opportunity there than Georgia was able to capitalize on.
So I want to finish with this. Now you got 2 weeks to get ready for Alabama, and it's a big game. And it was always going to be a big game. And Alabama being impressive at Wisconsin on Saturday, I think only intensifies this further, that Alabama kind of entered the chat, if you will, on Saturday. They had their performance that was kind of in keeping with what Georgia did against Clemson and a couple, Texas against Michigan. This was Alabama's moment to be introduced to the 2024 season. And so now Georgia, we would presume, has to be at its best to beat the Crimson Tide. We haven't seen Georgia in Bryant-Denny Stadium very much in the Kirby Smart era. This will be the only time they've played in kind of a full stadium situation here. So how does Georgia use this 2 weeks to get ready? Let me start with this, and you can add anything you want to. I mean, I think the main thing is if Georgia can get healthier with its defensive line, then that alone, to me, I think makes Georgia a much better football team. But in addition to that, or perhaps beyond that, what else can these next 2 weeks for Georgia do to be ready for as crucial a football game as what we've seen Georgia probably play?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's do your job, right? You have to be able to execute on your assignment. And, we've spent all this time talking about the offense. Defensively, obviously they held Kentucky to 4 field goals, and you're showing Jalen Walker exceptional game by him, even if it doesn't show up on the stat sheet. Just the amount of impact that he had on the game was truly next level, and we need more players like that. What I saw is a lot of good run fits, but not a lot of beaten blocks. So especially up front, I think getting healthy there, we have to be able to get off blocks. We've got some of the most athletic second and third level players in this country playing on this defense, and they can get into spaces in a hurry, but not allowing those yak yardage. You watch Kentucky play, and it was we're hitting them at the line. It becomes a 3-yard gain. You hit them at a 3-yard gain, it became a 6 or 7 yard gain, and that's how they were able to maintain possession. And we found ourselves in the type of game that it played out to be on Saturday. So I don't think every weekend's going to be that way. You can knock a team out from that type of game by one of two things: either getting them off the field and converting on third downs defensively, or that starts with winning on first and second down. I think that's where Kentucky won, is that they stayed on schedule more drives than not with how they were able to execute in first and second down. But the flip side of that is you score points offensively, and a team can't play that way. So as we go into these games, Alabama and the slate that sits in front of us, a couple weeks after that, you got Texas and Ole Miss and Tennessee. There's a lot of talented teams. For this Georgia team, it's a matter of we've got to do a better job of doing our job, your individual job, whatever that is, offensive line, defensive line. If you're blocking as a wide receiver or a tight end, we have to execute better. And the good news is you've got 2 weeks to really focus on that. Let's start interior line with Micah Morris. Yeah. Now that you're having to step up, one of the most physically probably powerful players on this team, period. But there's times where you're watching his eyes and they're wrong. So can we get you to that point in this next 2 weeks to be able to play with enough confidence in execution of what we're asking you to do, to utilize those skills? And I think that is a microcosm across the board of saying, all right, once you understand what the ask is, now I need you to use those gifts that have made you these 4- and 5-star players and play at this high level that you're capable of.
I think that's exactly right, John. I think that's really well said. We appreciate your time here today. Obviously, we got a little bit of time to get ready for one that really matters coming up in a couple of weeks. We'll certainly look forward to hearing more from you about that as we get a little bit closer. And, of course, as always, thank you for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
Hey, you know what I love, BA, is that we can talk about all the things that can get cleaned up from Georgia and the improvements that need to be made after a win. And yet another Georgia win, something that needs to be celebrated. It is hard to do, especially as many times in a row as Georgia's done it. So it's still and always will be great to be a Bulldog. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs indeed, John, and very well said. Thank you very much.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, John is so right about that. And I said this in the post-game show on Saturday, that, 42 straight wins in the regular season, 28 straight against SEC teams, 13 straight on the road. I believe that's the number. Eventually, it's going to come to an end. And I think Saturday is a reminder of something I've said before a lot, that to me, the most likely outcome of this season was always that Georgia would lose a game at some point in time. It was always the most likely outcome. And Saturday is, to me, a reminder that it's not necessarily going to be the most likely suspect who brings you down. If somebody does eventually bring you down, it's going to be some random one-off game that you maybe wouldn't have expected. I think there's a chance that's the case. I'll tell you, though, and listen, ultimately, I try to wear my emotions on my sleeve, and I'm just like many of you. Gosh, I really did not want that to happen. Oh, my gosh, I did not want that to happen. It's like we all know it. Eventually, Georgia's going to lose a game. We just know it. Man, I did not want that to be Saturday. Oh, I did not want that to be Saturday. So I was just glad they pulled it out. I was glad they found a way to win, glad they preserved that. A lot to work on. We'll nitpick that because that's just sort of what we do. But, oh, my gosh, was I just so thankful they found a way to win that game. I absolutely was. And this is one of the reasons why I think the game against Alabama is really important, because of where it falls in the schedule. It's early. I don't think you want to give up your margin for error early in the season, because ultimately, in a year in which 12 teams make the playoff and everybody, at least of the main teams, kind of playing much tougher schedules, there are probably just fewer must-win games than there used to be. Big, bold print, must-win. There are probably fewer must-win games than there used to be. But if you lose early, I think you do run the risk of a must-win game happening at some point in time. In other words, if Georgia were to lose to Alabama on, 2 Saturdays from now, that would not eliminate Georgia from playoff contention, obviously. But if we're being honest here, a Georgia loss to Alabama, in other words, losing a game in the month of September with 2 very difficult months still to come, it would increase the possibility that maybe Georgia might miss the playoff. I don't think it ever would occur that way. But if you did lose to Alabama, in addition to the embarrassment of losing to Kalen DeBoer in his first SEC game and all of that, there would also just be a certain margin for error that was just sort of given up right at the beginning of the season. So something to keep in mind. Now, let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, because frankly, all this stressful talk about a bad game against Kentucky, going to Alabama, I'd much rather be going to Perfect Day Coco-Cay than Tuscaloosa, Alabama. If we're just being honest, if you gave me my choice of locations to be for a couple of days, the gorgeous sunshine, the pristine blue, clear waters of Perfect Day Coco-Cay, a lot better for me than Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and, Dreamland Barbecue, wherever else you're going to be eating there. The good news is, while I won't be in Perfect Day Coco-Cay in a couple of weeks, obviously I will be able to be back again at Perfect Day Coco-Cay again at some point in time soon, because I know the way to get there. And the only way to get there is on board a wonderful Royal Caribbean cruise ship, just like Utopia of the Seas. And obviously coming up in April, we all get our chance to be on board there for that, and we are all looking forward to it as a part of our DawgNation cruise. I hear from folks all the time, including again on Saturday, folks saying, BA, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be ready to go on that DawgNation cruise. We've had a bunch of commenters lately saying, BA, I got signed up. I'm ready to be there. So we want you there too. So give our friend Jessica Slater a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. April of 2025, as a part of our DawgNation cruise. We'd love to have you there for it. All right, we got big news around the SEC here today, where there is reporting that needs to be discussed. First of all, Florida lost in pretty embarrassing fashion to Texas A&M on Saturday. And I'm just telling you, these are telling losses. To have a non-competitive game against Miami, to have a home game then against Texas A&M, A&M's playing without Connor Wegman. It's a backup quarterback, a first-year SEC coach, and the game is not even close. Man, that just tells you that Billy Napier is so in over his head as an SEC coach. And obviously, it's just a given that he cannot continue at Florida. That is a given. So now the question becomes, okay, well, when is this going down? And it is perhaps in place to go down much sooner than anybody would have realized, because USA Today is reporting that there has been money collected by the Bull Gator donors that they can now pay the very prodigious buyout that Napier would be owed, that some Florida donors are ready to do that. And in addition to that, there's a reporter from On3 who's also reported that there is a supposed board of trustees meeting today, originally unplanned, but now on the schedule for Florida, where you're left to wonder, wait, is Napier going to get fired right now? Has he coached his last game for the lousy, stinking Gators? The answer to that question is not obvious, but there is a chance that they may be ready to make the move on Napier at this moment. Now, look, obviously we're going to revel in this. And, of course, if it happens later on this afternoon, we'll have a chance to really sink our teeth in that on Wednesday because, as we told you, we will be pre-recorded for just tomorrow's show because of some corporate bigwigging I've got to do tomorrow, but hobnobbing with the corporate folks. But this could be about to go down. Now, I think it's really funny to kind of go back in time. When we told Florida that they were foolish for risking their future on a group of 5 coach when they had just had to fire Dan Mullen and Jim McElwain before that for not being very good, the idea they would entrust their future with an unproven group of 5 type commodity, the old so-called Sunbelt Billy, a Sunbelt coach as the savior for your program. We told Florida fans they were really on risky ground by trusting so much to him. They laughed at us because supposedly they knew better, and yet once again we were right. The same way that we told them that Dan Mullen wasn't as good as some of the media types were making him out to be, they laughed at us then. We've been right on this over and over and over again. And we'll just keep stacking up paraphernalia on our desk here of embarrassing Florida coaches because they've given us nothing but that now for a great number of years. So when this goes down, we're not going to be classy. We're going to be just as petty as we always are, making fun of just the absolute train wreck that Florida has become here right now that doesn't show any signs of ending any time soon. That is, I think, really funny. Now, the other thing is, and this is more about a sort of a big picture sort of college football topic at large. If Florida does move on Napier right now, I think the question is, well, how come they're doing it so soon? Some people would be saying, well, it's just because the negativity is so intense right now among Florida fans, they've got to do something to save that off. And to a certain extent, maybe that's kind of true. But the truth is that there's only so much you can do in season about that anyway. The money's already been donated. The tickets have already been bought. Even if fans don't come, or if they do come, show up and boo, the fact of the matter is everybody knows that Napier is essentially done no matter when it happens. If they make the move on Napier very quick, I think it's about something else. I think it's about the fact that when Napier was hired, he did not have the benefit of a very long on-ramp to get his roster together for his first season. I think if Florida can do that for the next guy, I think they would obviously want to, especially given the fact that this year the early signing period is so much earlier. It's the beginning of December as opposed to the sort of middle or end of December. It's a couple of weeks sooner. And I think that Florida wants something in place to try to hold on to a roster and then put a roster together for next season and for future years for whoever its next coach is. Now, we all know who their dream candidate seems to be right now. Probably Lane Kiffin. So let me just sort of toss a scenario out there just for a moment here. Let me just sort of give you kind of a bold prediction that's not likely to be true, but just put a pin in this. Just put a pin in this. Are we sure that Lane Kiffin coaches against Georgia in November? We've seen players opt out of seasons before. We've seen Lane Kiffin do crazy things in his professional career before, too. We certainly saw Lane Kiffin spend a good bit of the conclusion of the 2022 season with his mind on the Auburn job, even though eventually he doesn't take that job. Would you really put it past Lane Kiffin to leave Ole Miss, go to Florida before this season's even done? Now, he wouldn't start coaching at Florida, but he may be on his way out at Ole Miss and actually to the point where in November, especially if Ole Miss has lost a couple of football games, where he's not even coaching there. Now, there's also the flip side of this, which is given the fact that Lane Kiffin's proven very good at raising like NIL dollars at Ole Miss, maybe the Florida job's less attractive right now because of the fact that he is actually raising a decent amount of money there with the Rebels, and obviously there's at least presumably a lower level of expectation at Ole Miss than what at least used to exist at Florida. But if Lane Kiffin really is interested in making a move and getting to a program that most people think is of a larger stature than Ole Miss, are we sure that he wouldn't just leave during the season? And this big November game that some Georgia fans have had circled because of Lane Kiffin in part, that maybe Kiffin's not even there by the time that game is played? Because if Florida gets rid of Napier earlier, they're trying to start their clock to get the next guy in place, and the next guy that they would want is presumably hired and employed somewhere. This could be a coaching carousel, in other words, unlike any we've ever seen before. And if Florida makes the move against Napier this week, as some think they might, that only accelerates what could be a crazy couple of months to follow. It will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Couple of golden shoes for you as we say goodbye to you here today. Obviously, Georgia fans still having a great time in Lexington, even if the overall performance wasn't maybe quite what some hoped that it would be. We'll give you one of those examples as part of our golden shoe here today. Our buddy William Perry sends this in. His good friend, significant other, Shanna Jarrett. William says, Shanna's throwing away a perfectly good Kentucky boy. So there you see the poor Kentucky child. What appears to be thrown in the dumpster there from Shanna. And William Perry sends that, a golden shoe nomination. Very funny stuff there. We will give golden shoes all around, including the tremendous acting job by the young Kentucky fan being a part of that there, too. How about another golden shoe going out here now? Our buddy Fantastic Six writing in to say, I took DawgNation Daily's advice and got me a case of Dr. Pepper, strawberry and cream soda for game day. So good. And tags Dr. Pepper in that there as well. Boy, don't you love to see that? Folks enjoying the Dr. Pepper, making it a big part of their game day experience, as we also talk about here on the show. Fantastic. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, and I know you enjoyed all of that. We will give you a golden shoe there indeed. And the lousy, stinking Gators. It's been 1,409 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. Now, think about how miserable that period has been. How many head coaches they've had during that time. How many, not only just not even beaten Georgia, not really beaten much of anybody in that same span there, too. We have mocked them every step of the way, and we are not slowing down anytime soon. That is our Gator Hater Updater. We'll see all of you back tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We will look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews cool down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. So we'll obviously let you kind of weigh in on what you didn't like about the game against Kentucky. You want to talk about the future for Billy Napier. We can kind of get into that. My sort of crazy take that if Lane Kiffin is the guy they want, do they want him in place in time to get something out of the December signing period? And is there a chance that Kiffin would leave Ole Miss before the season is done? We saw Brian Kelly leave Notre Dame a couple of years ago when Notre Dame was still alive for a playoff spot. So college football arguably has been sort of trending in this direction, perhaps, for some time. And, maybe that's the next. Let's see what else. Let's go to Facebook here for a moment. We'll find out what's going on there. Keith Folds asking about our good friend Miriam Corbin. Don't really see her here today. Orion Walker says, I'm tired of these complaining fools. No, I'm not a Bobo fan either, but he went undefeated last year, and we were 3-0 no matter how it sliced, but folks want to complain. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there's always going to be reasonable room for some discussion and disagreement. For instance, like I am a big Georgia fan, of course. I wear Georgia gear every day, or at least DawgNation gear. I wear red and black essentially every day. But I don't work for Georgia. You know what I'm saying? I work for you. So my job is not to reflect the conversation Georgia wants me to have. My job is to reflect the conversation that you want me to have. So if there is room to say, boy, this wasn't a great game, then I think it's our job to do that. Now, we put some parameters around that. You've never really heard us be too critical of players because they're half my age, and so therefore that always feels a little gross to sort of pick on somebody who's half my age. We don't really do very much of that. We are always a lot quicker to sort of, get after coaches than we are to get after players for the most part. But at the same time, if things are not good, we have a little bit of an obligation to be honest about things not being good, because that way when it is good again, we have the credibility to properly narrate that experience too. In other words, if all we did was tell you everything is great, when something really was great, we don't quite have the same credibility in our voice at that point in time. So that's kind of, my perspective there on that. But even in the midst of saying, boy, this wasn't a great day for Georgia, whatever that particular day might be. In this case, it was a game closer than expected against Kentucky. In the midst of doing that, I also believe, and this is one of the things I think I probably do well, because while I am a Georgia fan and pretty emotional about my Georgia fandom, as I told you before, I really did not want Georgia to lose on Saturday. Really just please find a way to win this game. The one thing I am pretty good about is I don't think we get overtaken by emotion on this show. In other words, I think it's okay to say, boy, Georgia didn't score enough points on Saturday, without saying every one of these coaches is going to be fired and this season's a disaster. Georgia's, embarrassed. I think some of what you see, with all due respect, from some Georgia fans, not Ryan, certainly, and not very many people in our audience at all, but some of what you see from some Georgia fans after a game is taking a point that's probably undeniably true and exaggerating it to an extreme level to the point where it's no longer true. In other words, if I came on here and said, boy, Georgia just didn't look very good offensively. I don't know if it's Mike Bobo's play calling or if it's Carson Beck's, quarterbacking or what the explanation was, but Georgia just simply didn't score enough points. And if they don't play better than that against Alabama or Texas, they're not beating any of those teams. If I said that, wouldn't that be true? Of course I think it would be. And I think that we would all acknowledge that's just sort of the basic facts of the situation. That wasn't very good. I'm not smart enough to know why it wasn't any better. But if it's not improved in the next few weeks, it's going to get really, really bad. That's, of course, true. But what we don't do is say, this season's already over and Mike Bobo ought to be fired and Kirby Smart was an idiot for hiring him in the first place. We don't say that because we have a track record of Georgia just sort of figuring this stuff out when it matters most. That Georgia, I guess, will probably play much better against Alabama and will give Texas a really strong run for its money, despite the fact that the whole world seems to be in love with the Longhorns right now, because for the last few years, Georgia just seems to sort of figure it out. Now, one of these days they're going to lose again, but for the most part, Georgia just sort of seems to figure it out. So we can call balls and strikes. We can say the game that Georgia played wasn't nearly as good as it, probably should have been or needs to be, with the belief that the people who have succeeded before will find a way to succeed again. Jay Fizz says that Bobo has a history. That's why he gets the hate. But the problem with that is, and listen, I don't have the energy to do this today. I really don't. I just don't have the energy. The problem is that Bobo's history, am I right about this? The two highest scoring offenses in Georgia history are both Mike Bobo offenses, right? Last year's in 2014. Those are the two, on a per game average, the two highest scoring offenses of Georgia ever, right? So, I mean, I just think that for whatever reason when it comes to this particular guy, and listen, I am not Mike Bobo's agent. Mike Bobo, I promise you, is not giving me any money for defending him. So, I'm more than happy to let Mike defend himself. I really, really am. But I do think it's kind of weird that when people are like, hey, it's the track record, that's when we're getting after Bobo. I would say that the track record in some respects would be also a defense of Bobo there as well because, Georgia essentially, other than the Alabama game, and that's obviously, an important fact to consider here, they were essentially as good offensively last year as they had been the year before, at least in terms of total points scored. And by the way, I think we're going to get more into this on tomorrow's show. Do y'all remember? And I love Todd Monken. I love Todd Monken. If we're making a list of the most important figures that have contributed to national championships for Georgia, Monken is very high on that list for me. But Todd Monken went to Lexington himself in 2022 And that also was not really a thing of beauty. So this idea that if Monken was there on Saturday, he would have fixed everything that was wrong with Georgia. Monken had his chance to do it in 2022. Now, it was a lot windier that night. I totally acknowledge that. But gosh, that game was just as bad as anything. Timon says, I don't dislike, this is on YouTube, I don't dislike Bobo, but look at the individual in those points per game stats. Was he scoring against weak teams and not against SEC caliber opponents? I mean, the actual truth is like they weren't. So let's look at this because that's a fair question. I mean, they did score 48 against UT Martin, but it's not like, it's not like they scored the majority of their points against these bad teams. I mean, they put a big number, for instance, on Ole Miss when Ole Miss was, ranked in the top 10. So they averaged 40 points per game last year, but it was only 48 versus UT Martin. It was just 45 versus Ball State. That's back during like the slow start era when they didn't score hardly any in the first quarter. So it's not like they heavily padded stats there. And they obviously had, really bad game against South Carolina and Auburn, but they put 51 on Kentucky last year, 43 on Florida, put 52 on Ole Miss. I mean, look, in back-to-back games last year, hung 52 on Ole Miss when Ole Miss was ranked in the top 10, and then went on the road and hung 38 on Tennessee and won the game 38-10. Like, that's not a bad offensive coordinator right there. If you're doing that to give Georgia a chance to, be in the national championship chase, the national championship picture, like that's a pretty good performance in a year that was overall pretty good statistically. Now, once again, to be fair and to kind of like align myself with the fan chatter here for a moment, Georgia only scored 24 points in the SEC championship. That's not enough. I mean, of course, they didn't win the game, so clearly it wasn't enough. But I mean, if you want to look at what Monken did the best, Monken hung numbers in like playoff games and championship games. It was, 50 against LSU in the SEC championship in 2022, 40 whatever against Ohio State. They needed every single one of them points. 65 against TCU. I mean, they were 30-plus points in both of the playoff games in 2021. I mean, Todd Monken hung numbers in big games. And Bobo obviously needs to do more of that here this year. So can we just say this, is that I believe it takes 30 to win at Alabama next week, or, 2 Saturdays from now, next week, yeah. I believe it takes 30 to win against Alabama. And if Georgia scores 24 in Tuscaloosa, because I believe that's the same number of the points they also scored there in 2020. Am I right about that? They scored 24. So 24 is not a good number against Alabama. It just hasn't been. 24 is not a good number. Takes 30 to win against Alabama next week. I believe they'll get there. I think that Georgia probably wins the game. And if they don't score that 30-point number, if they're hovering around that 24-point mark, which, as I said before, has been the sign of a bad game against the Crimson Tide more than one time, then we can have a better conversation or a more detailed conversation about that. But I'm not quite ready to go there just yet. Foster Moss says, can you see Florida going at Stoops? I believe he can make them a winner again. He knows he can't win at Kentucky. Problem is Texas A&M tried to hire Stoops. The fan revolt in College Station made that impossible. And if A&M fans are doing that, I believe that Florida fans would do that too. I think there's a better chance that Stoops stops coaching soon, more so than Stoops takes one of these more attractive SEC jobs. I just don't think that nobody else seems to think that Mark Stoops is as good a coach as Kirby Smart seems to. Now, given the close result on Saturday, maybe Kirby's right and everybody else is wrong. But Kirby's affection for Stoops does not seem to be matched by many others in the SEC. Johnny Surfdog says Kirby's post-game comments trying to compliment our offense and acting like everything's okay is him feeling guilty for handcuffing those guys by refusing to permit downfield passing. I mean, maybe this was Kirby's, as you say, handcuffs on the offense. And, I mean, Georgia is a weird team, and then I do believe that privately they know there are a lot of games they can't lose. They would never admit it publicly, and on Saturday they came close to losing, even though that was supposed to be one they couldn't lose. I mean, maybe, and listen, as I told you off the top of the show, one thing I'm pretty good at doing, I'm pretty good at predicting what will happen. I just am. I'm pretty good at predicting what will happen. I am not, though, very good at explaining why something happened. I'm not smart enough to do that. When it comes to predicting what will happen, yeah, I have to admit I'm pretty good at that. When it comes to telling you why it happened, I have no idea. In other words, I don't know why Georgia didn't play better offensively, and I'll probably never know that. Frankly, I'm not even all that interested in that. In other words, well, these were the plays they weren't running, and here's what they weren't showing, and because there are plenty of people who tell you, oh, well, Mike Bobo's running the exact same offense that Todd Monken was, and that if you don't like Mike Bobo's offense, you're just telling you didn't like the Todd Monken offense either. Perhaps that's true. I don't know that for sure myself, though. I'm not smart enough to know that. I really, really try to lean into what I can do and not fake my way through what I can't do. And I can't tell you why Georgia wasn't better on Saturday. Maybe it is, as Johnny suggests. Maybe they really were just saving everything for Alabama. I would say there's at least a chance that's true. Perhaps that's the case. Either way, though, we have seen Georgia find a different level of achievement in some of these games that perhaps matter the most, and maybe on Saturday that'll be another example of that. Maybe that is indeed the case. All right, let's take a couple more comments here just for a moment. Bobby and Amy Merchant says, I think that Kirby took it easy on Stoops. I know I had a lot of emotions there on that particular night. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Kirby's obviously pretty hard sometimes on the coaches he hates. Maybe he does take it a little easier on some of the ones that he likes. I don't know. Savannah Bryan thinks that what Jamon Dumas-Johnson and Brock Vandagriff knew about the game, that knowledge factor was real. Cats seemed to be a step ahead of the Dogs all night. Maybe there is something to that. Vandagriff was obviously better against Georgia than he had been against South Carolina. Now, right now, that South Carolina defensive line is pretty good, first of all. And sometimes we also just sort of see teams play better when you don't always expect them to. JP, on the sort of the absence of the slant patterns from Georgia, doesn't seem like we see a lot of that. Let's do a couple of other comments here just for a moment. By the way, speaking of leaving during the season, DT reminds us there's no better example of that than Bobby Petrino, who did that with Atlanta to go back to Arkansas. An example of a team that wanted a coach in place quickly, hiring Bobby Petrino. That's a really good point, DT. Really good point. Very good point indeed. JP, on the subject of the bubble screens, he says those were great in the 90s, but defenses today are built to stop the spread, and bubble screens are not a way to attack those type of defenses. Yard Dog says we all love Monken, but he's 0-2 in the NFL right now. Our players were just a lot better than the competition when he was here, and our defense gave the offense favorable opportunities. Maybe that's the case there as well. Senior Dog 54 likes Monroe Freeling. Well, the one thing that Georgia was doing on Saturday again was rotating and getting Freeling involved, and obviously it's to Georgia's benefit to give him that experience, and my guess is they look for more opportunities to do that when they can. I mean, he was in, I think, even on the touchdown, right? I mean, so Georgia's playing Freeling a lot right now, and I don't think that's some sort of like coach's decision where if it's Truss or Green, depending on who he's in for, that somehow they're being benched. I think they just want Freeling to be a part of the rotation. They did the same thing with Amarius Mims in 2022. Scott Harris pointing out that the swamp was emptied by the third quarter on Saturday, and it really was. Really was. Scott Harris also shouting out a big win for Georgia State here this weekend. Very good there, too. DT pointing out, according to the SEC Network, fourth time in the last 5 seasons, the AP number 1 has dropped after a win. So there is some of that beauty contest stuff going on here. P. Rich says, I only compare Georgia to the elites. This is on YouTube. Can we hang with, as he says, the other sort of top teams in the country? Yeah, I think it's way too early to say. I mean, we didn't see Alabama really play a good game at all until Saturday. We haven't seen Ohio State really do anything of note as of yet. Georgia still has about as impressive of a win as anybody has with the way they easily dispatched Clemson. Spencer Clark says you got to get push up front to run the ball. And I think that some of that, I think we live in a day and age now where the old mantra of, hey, you got to run to set up the pass. I think some of that today is about you got to pass to set up the run. And we saw lots of instances where, as John said, maybe Kentucky just had more bodies than Georgia could block. We also saw situations where Kentucky had a lot of defensive linemen in the game at times too, like one of those, like what do you call it, like a bear front type thing where you've got the extra defensive tackle in the game as opposed to the pass rushing defensive end. It seemed like there were some moments on Saturday where Kentucky also had some of that going on too. Aaron Dixon says we're not holding anything back. We just didn't execute. Maybe that's the case there as well. All right, a couple of final comments, then we have to go. Bill Sanders says there wasn't any beauty contest going on Saturday. No, that is probably true. Frank Crowder also mentioning that Texas has the weakest schedule in the SEC. It certainly appears, and we've said this now a couple of times, that Texas was certainly done some favors. I don't necessarily think intentionally, but for people who kind of think about them getting, preferential treatment, the schedule that the SEC gave them this year does not seem to slow much of that kind of talk down. Barry Watkins asking about Tyron Ingram-Dawkins. First of all, when he was in the game on Saturday, was playing really well. Obviously dealt with an injury, but to my eyes, he did come back into the game. So we won't hear from Kirby this week until Tuesday night. There's typically a Monday press conference for Kirby, but this week there isn't because Georgia doesn't play on Saturday. So on Tuesday night, we probably get more of an update on TID, but he did come back into the game, so maybe that's a good sign. Wayne Kirkland wants to feed Lawson Lucky. We'll see if that's the case. All right, final comments, and we got to go. Randy Payne says Kentucky wanted it more. They certainly came out pretty motivated just based on, maybe being unhappy with the way they'd been talked about after last week's game. Yard Dog says, my opinion of the Tennessee onside kick. So did y'all see this? In the first quarter of the game on Saturday against Kent State, Tennessee was up 30-0. Do I have this right, Yard? 30-0. Did an onside kick to get the football, scored another touchdown to set a record for most points in a quarter in, I believe, college football history. They scored 37 first-quarter points against Kent State. That, to me, is not great. I don't know all the context for it, but that's pretty not great. 65-0 at halftime. I believe it was actually Kent State that refused the running clock in the second half, so maybe Kent State was fine with everything that was going on there. But Tennessee certainly likes the idea of kind of hanging big numbers here right now. But, yeah, Yard Dog, I saw that. That was pretty wild. Let us see what else. Anything else? One more time on Facebook before we go. Brandon Griffin says we threw one pass over 10 yards in the first half against Kentucky. I think you'll see a drastic change versus Bama. Yeah, let me give you a name to consider on that. I believe we'll talk more about this theory this week. Who's the one guy we haven't seen Georgia really do much for at all thus far this year? That's Dillon Bell. Dillon Bell is a guy that we thought would be a major part of this Georgia offense. Now, maybe Bell is struggling in the absence of Ra Thomas and stepping into that new role. Maybe that's not easy for Dillon to do right now. I won't pretend to know more than I do on that particular topic. But if there are some wrinkles that Georgia is saving, could perhaps some of those be the kinds of plays that get Dillon Bell more involved in the Georgia offense, just given how many different things you're perhaps capable of doing with him? Keep number 86 in your mind, in other words, as we start thinking more about that. Keith Volt said that Kirby would never do what Tennessee did on Saturday. Absolutely would not. Absolutely would not. That there's nothing to be proven by beating Kent State as bad as you can possibly beat them. Now, I still think that Tennessee's pretty good, and I thought that before Saturday. But this idea that you got to try to score 100 points against Kent State, that seems pretty weird. All right, so we're going to go for now. Thanks for being here, y'all. Check out R.S. Andrews online at rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. I'll see you back here Wednesday for live comments. But a really fun show tomorrow, recorded this afternoon, so it's all going to be fresh, new stuff, and a lot more on the Georgia offense within all that there, too. So all of that is to come. And thanks to R.S. Andrews, who makes all this possible there, too. Y'all can find them online at rsandrews.com. Water heater goes out. In many cases, they can replace it for you the same day. So please find them there, rsandrews.com. And we'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.